Looking forward to our next conversation, and I thought it was really cool for Brian Kelly to recognize in his press conference Wilson Alexander when Wilson asked him a question, because Wilson was just given a incredible honor and award, man, as he was named the 2023 Edward Aschoff Rising Star Award, which the Football Writers Association of America decides who wins that, and that was announced last Monday. I believe it was a week ago today, as he was the winner. He's the fourth winner named for Aschoff, and Aschoff was a fantastic journalist. He was even a better dude. I had the chance to work alongside him many of SEC Media Days, had him on the radio show many a times, and he unfortunately passed away suddenly 4 years ago, and it's great to see his legacy being carried on, and then somebody here in our market, Wilson Alexander, being named to that award winner. People, if you don't know it, that goes to somebody that is just fantastic at journalism, and we are very lucky to wake up and read the coverage that the Advocate puts forth, especially with their sports department, Wilson and the crew. So, Wilson, congratulations, man.
Thanks, Jordy. That's very flattering, and I appreciate it. I did not expect Brian Kelly to say anything about it, and when he did, I was very touched, because that was certainly not necessary in the midst of his first press conference and talking about preseason football to take a moment to do that. So that was very kind of him, and thank you. I'm glad you got to meet Ed. I never had the chance to. Everything I heard about him was just top notch. So to be in the same sentence as him is just an honor.
An incredible dresser. The dude was always sharp. He always wore suit, always wore tie, always had the freshest shoes on, and always had great takes, man. He was from a Florida, University of Florida alum, so it was always spirited debate when he'd come around, and a fantastic dude. So congratulations. You win a great head of hair.
Thank you.
For the award. But talking about Brian Kelly, Wilson, let's start there, because talking a little bit about the history of LSU football, you know, I'm from here. I've been around here. I went to school. So, I mean, it was kind of like you were in it, almost osmosis in it. And I started covering the program as a young journalist when Saban was here. So you kind of saw the personalities change from Saban to Miles to Orgeron to Kelly. And for the first time since really Saban, and I don't mean this disparagingly at all, it's just that the program seems under direction that has a plan for what is next. And even stuff like recognizing you at a press conference, that's something little. That's something that, may even go unseen if LSU has success. But I think it's one of those small details that they're paying attention to now.
You certainly would have just a better perspective on it than I would, having, like you said, been around this program for that would be 4 coaches. When I first came in, it was Ed Orgeron, but even the difference between Ed and Brian Kelly is, I think, really just a stark contrast there in terms of, like you said, sort of the long-term plan, and sort of even just in press conferences, the way things are articulated. And that's not to disparage Ed, and he got so much flack for his accent, which I thought was unfair. I still hear it from people when I'm from Georgia, and I go back home and people ask me about covering LSU, and like, oh, Ed Orgeron, how do you understand him? I'm like, you can understand him. It wasn't that difficult as people maybe seem to think it was. But it was Brian Kelly, just the wealth, the thought put into every single answer. I mean, think back to SEC Media Days. There was a reporter who was asking a lot of the coaches about AI in college football. The only one with a already thought out answer was Brian Kelly.
Good point.
Talking about maybe using it in recruiting and building recruiting profiles through AI. He is, I think, got a good bit of foresight, and is always trying to maybe look ahead to what's coming down the line so that LSU is prepared for it. And that is something that could be really advantageous for this program long term.
First couple of days of fall camp in the books. They're back at it this morning. I hate to jump from such a broad place, but what has stood out in just seeing them on the field for the first time?
The first impression, because we've only seen them for a few days. I mean, pads just came on over the weekend, like just shoulder pads came on over the weekend, and so they're still in the place where they're acclimating and all of that. But the first impression for me was just how different this team looks from the same moment it did a year ago, where it was still kind of figuring out how Brian Kelly wanted things done, running around on the field in a way that felt slightly chaotic at times because they were sort of trying to get used to his style. And you don't feel that anymore. Everybody here, even though they've got a lot of new players, 15 transfers, 25 freshmen, or 24 freshmen, excuse me, there is just this sense of understanding that the way he wants it to happen. And they're still working out kinks in that regard, but there's that. And then there's also just a continuity on this team that is obvious when you're watching practice because, especially us in media, we're looking around for, okay, who's playing where and who's doing what. And when you look on the offensive side in particular, it's like, all right, we already know who's on the starting five on the offensive line, at least for the start of camp. Obviously, that could change if somebody really has a great camp. But, the quarterback is determined, and you kind of know who the top receivers are. There's just such a difference from this same weekend and, the start of camp a year ago.
The offensive line is a group that I think really when you talk about the identity change that Brian Kelly has brought forth through LSU football, it's a great example that you can point at and say, just look at the depth and the numbers that he's been able to accumulate and quality in that as well. It seems as if they have another freshman in Lance Hurd that could potentially crack this five. Do you believe that? And ultimately, do you believe that is their best five with him a part of it?
It may be. That's an interesting way to put it. Like, is he part of the best five? Because in terms of the size, I mean, he's 6'6" and 340 pounds. And Emory Jones is not a small human. He looks small compared to Zalance Hurd. They're both around the same height. But Zalance has another, 25 pounds on him. And it's not just bad weight. Like, he moves really well with it, too. And I want to see him in, 11-on-11 and some, full padded one-on-ones before I'm ready to say he's the part of the best five and he needs to be in the starting lineup because Emory was a quality, SEC tackle last year, especially further down toward the end of the year once he'd gotten a good bit of experience. And, there's a lot of talk about, is he really more of a guard than a tackle? And maybe so. With the experience that LSU already has in front of Lance, it might be hard for him to crack the field right away, but then maybe it's a situation like we saw last year where a few games in, like how Emory got in the lineup, especially because Lance just got here over the summer. These are his very first college practices, and there is a little bit of an adjustment to that usually. Like with Harold Perkins, he got here over the summer last year, and it took a few games for him to really get onto the field. And so maybe that's kind of what happens here with Lance, but it's going to be hard to keep him off for a long time, I think.
Yeah.
But we'll have to kind of see for sure as we get into camp here because, the size and the athleticism that is there is very apparent right off the bat.
On the other side of the offensive line, on the other side of the line of scrimmage, Mason Smith is back. All we've heard is how motivated he is to get to this season. What have you seen of him in the short time of getting him back on the field?
Well, healthy, first of all, and it just sort of looks like that injury coming off of that probably won't be a problem, which anytime you're coming off of an ACL, even as somebody as athletic and talented as Mason, who had already been fully cleared and all of that, you still want to be able to see that they can do it right away, because it sometimes takes guys a little bit longer to recover from something like that and actually look like their previous self. But Mason so far in practice looks like he's moving around really well. There's no limitations whatsoever to what he's doing. Nothing like extra on the knee other than like a sleeve underneath the braces that all of the defensive linemen wear. And so he looks really good. I mean, looks physically like he's been working out this entire time, which he has, obviously. And he just looks like he's ready to really kind of resume and pick up where he left off before he got injured.
New faces on that defensive line behind that front four, even the guys on the outside are changing over. What have you seen from guys that have transferred in and some of the depth that they're trying to get in a rotation before they get to Orlando?
That's one of the things that's most significant to me is the depth here. Looks like it's been addressed. That was certainly a problem or an area of concern going into the offseason was the fact that this defensive line needed depth, especially at tackle. Mekhi Wingo and Jacqueline Roy had played more snaps than any defensive tackle duo in the country last year, and the LSU needed to sort of give them a little bit of be able to give them a break and actually have a rotation so they could hold up throughout a season. Mekhi Wingo joked last year at the bowl game about how he was happy he wouldn't have to play 70 or 80 snaps in the Citrus Bowl again because it clearly had kind of worn on him a little bit. LSU looks like isn't going to have to do that again. Jordan Jefferson seems like a nice addition. Jacobian Guillory's just been playing with a lot more energy ever since the spring. He sort of seems to know that he is getting later in his career, and then he's also maybe just ready to kind of take that next step into being a bigger role here. And so they have a 4-man rotation with Mackay, Mason, Jordan Jefferson, and no, not that Jordan Jefferson, and Jacoby, and then they could be in good shape, and then actually, then continue to see where guys come along like Jalen Lee from Florida, and Parrish Sand looks more like he's going to be probably a defensive end than a tackle, but maybe he can slide in somewhere, and then you're starting to feel better about the depth of that group there in the middle.
Andrew Messina, a listener, has a question for our friend Wilson Alexander. He asks about future first-rounder Savion Jones. I said Savion Jones when he showed up to LSU that he could potentially be a first-rounder, or I thought he would be a first-rounder. And Quincy Wiggins. What have you seen from a couple of defensive ends that are going to have expectation to play?
I'm really excited to watch Savion this season because you can see that there's so much talent there as a pass rusher. Last year he was 3rd on the team in sacks, and he was a part-time player. If he can continue to develop as a run defender, then he's, I think, going to have a really good season. He's the one who continues to get the first-team reps at defensive end. That was the same way in the spring. And Brian Kelly has mentioned him a few times over the summer when asked about sort of breakout players, guys to watch. Savion was someone who he mentioned as well, and that's usually a good sign. This is somebody who I would be surprised if is not the defensive end starter against Florida State. But he's got guys right behind him like Quincy Wiggins and Deshaun Womack, 5-star freshman, who Quincy, was a little bit raw coming in and had to kind of needed that year to develop. But he looks like he's made some good strides in terms of what he's able to do, and he's kind of getting a lot of those second-team reps. He just looks a little bit more used to the game in the college level at this point. And Deshaun comes in looking like somebody who can really play early in some kind of capacity. He missed spring practice, but he was a 5-star for a reason. So there's a really great kind of group. In terms of like when you look across the team, defensive end might just be in terms of the concentration of talent, it might have the most on the team because Quincy was a 5-star and at certain recruiting sites, and Deshaun is pretty much a consensus 5-star, and Savion even I think it was at On3 was a 5-star, and so you've got a lot of a group there that's just really, really talented. I think Savion's still the front of that, but those 2 young guys are going to push him.
Defensive back has always been an area of concern going into this season. Even Brian Kelly has been out loud talking about that if there is a red flag in the program, it may be the depth at that spot. This is another position that took in a ton of transfers and has a lot of new faces. What has been your takeaway after seeing them on the field first couple of days?
So to start with at cornerback specifically, it's a position that is still kind of up in the air. It has been interesting, though, to see that Zy Alexander, the transfer from Southeastern, making that jump up to the FBS, he continues to be getting the first team work, and that's what was happening during the spring too. He hasn't gotten overtaken yet by J.K. Johnson or Denver Harris, who are both coming from Power 5 schools. And so he's continuing to hold on to that first spot, and we'll have to see how that shakes out. But he's been there. And then Deuce Chestnut, after he got healthy, coming back into the fall, he's been the other first team corner for the first few practices, and he's got that a lot of experience. He was somebody who they really liked getting him from out of Syracuse. A 2-year starter there with the Orange, an honorable All-ACC guy last year. Just a ton of experience already that seems like it could be really valuable in a room that doesn't have a lot of it. And so those are kind of the first 2 guys up, but we'll see how Denver and JK and LaTerrence Welch as well kind of come along in that room. That's a competition that's going to take a few weeks to be sure maybe who's there. There's a lot of talent, but I think it's a little bit raw with JK and Denver at this point. And that's maybe why you aren't seeing them jump Zy and Deuce right out of the gates. But preseason practice, a month of it, there's going to be time for those things to move around if they're able to sort of overtake those positions. Then at safety, Andre Sam's been getting a good bit of first team work right out of the gates here. A 7th-year transfer from Marshall and Tulane very briefly, but also McNeese. He looks like somebody who might be able to contribute at the SEC level. In a way that makes LSU feel a lot better about the depth. Brian Kelly even mentioned because of him maybe being able to use some 3 safety looks. And so I think the safety position is in a lot better spot than it was kind of coming out of spring practice where there was a good bit of concerns about the depth. You like Javian Toviano. Sage Ryan possibly as well. And so it ends up giving you a group that you feel better about in case something were to happen to Major Burns or Greg Brooks, even though LSU would still rather it didn't, because those are certainly the two frontline guys.
You mentioned Taviano, and this freshman class seems like they are going to have some impact guys. We mentioned Hurd, and you talked about Taviano. Is there any other ones that jump out after watching them on the field the first couple of days?
Deshaun Womack as well. They're a defensive end. He's a really good player. Let's see. There's interesting that the wide receiver group, there's a little bit of talent, but are they going to be able to jump sort of the veterans in front of them? It remains to be seen. Because Jaylen Brown, LSU put out a highlight of him making it looked like maybe one-handed grab down the sideline, or even if it wasn't one-handed, sort of having great body control to keep himself in bounds. And he's looked really, you can tell that he's really fast. That's kind of the first thing with him. And Kyle Parker just looks developed enough to maybe be able to contribute in some way, whether that's a punt returner in some or kick returner in some capacity, or being maybe a part of the receiver rotation. He looks like he could get on the field kind of early. And then I really like Whit Weeks at linebacker. Will he be a starter? No, because you got Omar Spates and you got Greg Penn and Harold Perkins, and even his older brother West in front of him. But there's a lot to like in terms of what he's bringing to the table and linebacker long term. LSU's depth is in such a better position than it was a year ago that you probably don't need to start 4 freshmen again. But there are some guys who are, I think, going to be able to get themselves a little bit of playing time and get into some rotations.
Obviously, the concern is Jimmy Lindsey's health. Right? I mean, that has to be said, and that needs to be at the forefront and make sure that he gets back to full health. From a football effect of that story, Wilson, I thought that the biggest group that was affected by Lindsey being out of the program for however long he will be out dealing with the health, is special teams, because of removing Jancic from just the everyday duties of paying attention to that spot and moving him to a defensive line, obviously, where he'll be sharing his time. I know that they wanted to coach special teams like a village, like they were approaching it with everyone. But what does this do for a unit that had question in the offseason, that needed to be replaced with leadership, now kind of being without a leader entering fall camp?
First of all, exactly, thoughts or with Jimmy Lindsey and his family, and that he's able to get back on the field as soon as he can and just be in good health again. In terms of how it addresses, sort of affects special teams, that's something I want to ask Brian Kelly about when we talk to him, I believe, tomorrow. Because, like you said, they wanted to do this in a very different way than they did last season. There is a person with the title of special teams coordinator, but there's so much other help from the assistants. Mm-hmm. You can see it at practice in the spring. Brad Davis coaching up the offensive linemen and the tight ends for blocking on field goals, and other coaches getting involved with like the gunners on punt, and Matt House, I believe, is sort of in charge of kickoff coverage in some way. And like, there's just such a team effort here that it seemed like one person in those roles getting shifted around maybe isn't going to change very much. Bob Diaco has a little bit of experience with special teams, and that's technically now his title. He'll be sort of at the very top of this food chain, per se, or this organizational chart, but it's not really something that falls completely on him. And schematically, a lot of it's coming from Lester Erb, who's an analyst, and that doesn't change. And so I don't think it's going to have a huge effect, but I am interested to hear Brian Kelly's answer on that to see if anything has changed because you shuffle these guys around. But because it was sort of decentralized now anyway, I'm not sure that it actually ends up making a huge difference in terms of maybe just changing some of these little units that people are working with.
Aaron Anderson seems like he is finding his place here at LSU, whether offensively or special teams. How do you envision him making an impact in his first season?
I'm fascinated to watch Aaron because you can see right away that he's just got some burst you don't find everywhere, even without pads on or anything. The way that he was able to catch and accelerate was a little bit different than everybody else. That backs up the fact that he was the number one player in Louisiana a couple of years ago, and the fact that this is somebody who certainly is going to help in the return game. He was catching punts at practice on Thursday. And he's also, I think, going to be really fascinating to see how he's used in the offense. Brian Kelly has sort of alluded to the fact that they're going to have to find him a role. And what was really interesting was to hear him talk about maybe that's getting some stuff out of the backfield, He's obviously more of a slot guy at about 5'9". But is it sort of like a Percy Harvin type role? Like, can you do that kind of stuff with him? Is he capable of that sort of things? I don't know. It's not like I've heard that necessarily, but it's just like, what does he project as? Because he's got that sort of speed and that kind of a size in terms of height. And, to hear those things about coming out of the backfield was really, really interesting. So I think that they could do a lot of things with him, be kind of a gadget guy, and also just, fit into the receiver rotation. As that shakes out, is going to be really interesting to watch.
All right, Wilson, I got two more for you. I'll get you out of here. Make sure you're reading his work at WHAlexander_ on Twitter. 2023 Edward Aschoff Award winner over at The Advocate, covering LSU football. We were very lucky to have him, and a couple more for him. Running back. You mentioned Aaron Anderson maybe getting some. Where is there enough carries? I mean, this room has gone from 2 players to almost 10 overnight. With Frank Wilson, I guess, leading the charge in recruiting. How do you see this running back competition shaking out?
It's something that's not too much. I don't think it's like anyone needs to get too caught up in actually who's RB1, which is like kind of a weird place to be. But because there are so many guys, and this is going to be a running back by committee situation, that there's going to be a good bit of rotation. And whoever has the first carry might not by the end of the year, and also is going to be spelled at times, depending on how they, who has the hot hand. I asked Mike Denbrock about that during the spring. How do you do that with a running back by committee? And it's kind of finding guys' strengths and weaknesses, and it's riding the hot hand at times. And Logan Diggs is going to be, I think, very heavily involved in this, coming from Notre Dame as a transfer. He had more yards last season than any other LSU running back. He also wasn't in a situation where he had a dual threat quarterback like Jaden Daniels, who was, accumulating quite a bit of yards, and especially on the ground. But this is still a spot where he can contribute quite a bit. Brian Kelly said that he was dealing with a hamstring injury over the summer, and that had to get him right. But he's somebody who's such an all-around back that I think he has a big role. Josh Williams comes back and is going to certainly be a part of this. And then, as we kind of get further in, we can see how Noah Cain and John Emery add to this, but even like Caleb Jackson is probably the most physically impressive of the entire group. And don't even count out Trey Bradford at this point. He's third time back on the team, but like you can tell that he's got a little something to him that is, intriguing, and got a little speed and some good hands, and maybe he can get on the field some. It's like you said, it's incredibly deep room. They're gonna have to figure out the pecking order here, but who ends up first in that second, third, fourth in that pecking order? I don't think will end up being. Not that it doesn't matter, but it's just like it's not like as important as it maybe has been in the past, because this is such a deep rotation. Brian Kelly calling this as deep and complete a running back room as he's ever coached, and that's coming from someone with 33 years as a head coach.
Wow. The star position is very intriguing as well with the competition there. A couple of transfers.
Jack position.
The jack position with Ogofu and Swinson. When you look at these two guys, what have you seen from them and how they impact immediately?
Obi, it seems like he's going to be the starter. That's what we've seen throughout the spring. Right here at the start of camp, he's been running with the first team defense. And the way Brian Kelly has talked about him since March is as somebody who seems like a starter, because of he was productive, but maybe not super productive as a pass rusher at Texas. But he's got so much college football experience under his belt already that it kind of gives him that edge. He's looks like he might, I think, going to be the starter there, at least against Florida State, and be an instant impact kind of player in terms of the role that he has to take on here at Jack linebacker and as that edge rusher. Braden was a little bit more raw, I think, coming over from Oregon, but he is kind of been the second team guy. And then you've also got Jackson Howard, a freshman. We were talking about freshmen earlier. He's there at Jack linebacker. And Deshaun is even kind of versatile enough to be sort of a hybrid. He's grown into more of a defensive end body, but he's still kind of got a versatility to kind of maybe come off the edge as a Jack linebacker at times in terms of rushing without his hand in the dirt. So I would say that OB is kind of the leader of the group at this point. And until something changes, he was probably your starter against Florida State.
Keep up the great work, man. Thanks for the time this morning. We'll be checking it again soon, and congratulations again.
Thank you, Jordy. Have a great day.
All right, man. I'll see you later. There he is, Wilson Alexander, checking in this morning from The Advocate. Make sure and hit him up on Twitter at WHAlexander_ is where you can read his work. And congratulations to him again for walking away with a really prestigious award in journalism, the 2023 Edward Aschoff Rising award winner named last week. So cool stuff. We'll be back. Close it out here on the Jordy Culotta Show, as always, built by R&B Builders.